much for attending another of our Environmental Humanities public lectures. I should say in advance that the lecture is being filmed, just so that you know. I am really delighted to have Arran Stibbe with us from the University of Gloucestershire. I think it's no exaggeration to say that he's really a world leader in the field of ecolinguistics, so it's really a great honour to have him here. He's the author of several books in the fields of ecolinguistics and sustainability literacy, including the Handbook of Sustainability Literacy, and his most recent book is very much related to the topic of his lecture tonight, and I'm just making sure I get the title right. Ecolinguistics, Language, Ecology and the Stories We Live By, came out in 1915. And Arran is the founder and convener of the Ecolinguistics Association. So if you kind of get your appetite whetted and want to find out more, you will find the association online, a network of 500 ecolinguists from around the world. And he's currently working on a free online course in ecolinguistics, which we've just learned about. We're going to hear a bit more about it tonight. We're very excited here at BSUEnvHums because we think we might be able to incorporate it in some way in our master's teaching here. So, Arran, over to you. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. That was a great introduction, and actually you said exactly what I was about to say. So, in 30 seconds, here we go. This is me. This is my name. This is where I work. This is my job. I'm a reader in ecological linguistics. So, how did I become that? Well, I studied human ecology here, and I studied linguistics here, and I started this organisation, and I edited this book, and I wrote this book, and I wrote this book, and this is the course, The Stories We Live By, a free course. There's already 170 people signed up, and the course isn't even finished yet. And there's 9 parts in the course, and on Monday I made 9 films, just spent the whole day filming, and they're going to be ready in about a month. So I thought I would use some of the material from this new course, and you're the first people to see this. So I'll start, and I'll talk for a bit, and then I'll get you to chat with each other and ask questions, then I'll talk for a bit more. So what are the stories that we live by? Well, you can get an idea about the stories we live by just by looking at a typical newspaper. So this is a real example from a couple of years ago of a newspaper, and the first article is about terrorism, as it so often is, the leading article in newspapers. In fact, terrorism is reported so often in the press that we can get this idea that terrorism is the greatest threat that we face. Now, of course, there's also 29,000 people who are dying from air pollution. There's 40,000 people who are dying from obesity-related illnesses. There's 24,000 people from preventable diabetes. But a very large amount of energy is directed towards terrorism because of this story that it's the biggest threat that we face. And then as you scroll down the newspaper more, then you have articles about the economy and this kind of obsession with economic growth. So money, profit, getting richer. That economic growth is the main goal of society. And then as you go down and down the newspaper even further, then right at the bottom, next to an article about sexy robots, the robot wars, you see this article. Life on Earth at risk, say scientists. And when you click on that, you get this chilling message that it's clear that the economic system is driving us towards an unsustainable future, and people of my daughter's generation will find it increasingly hard to survive. History has shown that civilizations have risen, stuck to their core values, and then collapsed because they didn't change. That's where we are at today. So this is Will Stephan, and he's talking about core values, like the core value that economic growth is the main goal of society. And other people have talked about similar things. So Mary Midgley talks about the myths that we live by. And these are myths which are dangerous myths that are taking us in the wrong direction. And Chet Bowers talks about root metaphors. So an overemphasis on the individual, the idea of technological progress as the goal of society. It's not becoming kinder or nicer or more ecological, but just having better gadgets. The obsession with economies and this focus on humans is the centre of everything. And Kingsnorth and Hine talk about stories. And they say that the most dangerous story of all, stories of human centrality, ever-expanding control over nature, our right to perpetual economic growth, our ability to transcend all limits. And there's a great quote from Ben Ockery about stories. So stories are the secret reservoir of values. Change the stories that individuals or nations live by, and you change the individuals and nations themselves. So in ecolinguistics, we take core values, root metaphors, myths, stories, and we wrap them up into the stories we live by. Now, in fact, it's another way of talking about ideologies and discourse analysis, but I found that if you talk about the stories we live by, then you can engage people and you can reach people. There's something wrong with the stories that we live by. So ecolinguistics, what it does is it uses linguistic analysis to reveal the stories we live by. Because often we don't even realise that they're stories. Like economic growth being the main goal of our society, we don't realise that that's just a story, that we could have other stories. So this is an example of that. And this is a few years ago when 3 supermarkets, Morrison's, Tesco and M&S, made less profit than usual. They sold less stuff at Christmas. And of course the newspapers treated this as a tragedy. Appalling slump, horror show decline, suffered, disastrous, headache, deteriorated, disappointed, gloomy. And in fact, when any company, even if it's a company making luxury goods that aren't even necessary, any company makes less of a profit is treated as a disaster. Now, 6 months before that, we had a really heavy, hot heat wave. And during that heat wave, sales of meat and barbecues, suntan cream, alcohol, hay fever remedies and sandals went up. And of course, newspapers thought this was fantastic. It's the highest good news, enjoyed, golden, buoyant, buoyed, boosted. And this is this message that we get behind news reports, always, that if we sell more stuff, then that's great. If we sell less stuff, then that's bad. So the way we would analyse this is that we'd say there's a particular kind of language that you will find used in news reports and various other places. And behind that type of language there is a story that high retail sales are good. And that's a story in the minds of individual people. So it's cognitive, so we look at cognitive science. But it's also a story in the minds of multiple people, right across society. It's like a social story. And we call this social cognition. It's like the mind of society. So this story is embedded in the mind of society. So the next thing that ecolinguistics does is it questions these stories from an ecological perspective. Now this will depend on the particular ecosophy or ecological philosophy of the analyst. So if you're looking for a world where people consume less, where we respect other species, we respect all species. If you're looking for a world that is more equal, where there's a better distribution of funds, then that would be your ecosophy, and that would help you to question the stories that we live by. So we could say this high retail sales are good. Well, if you're looking for a low consumption, high well-being society, then this would be a damaging or destructive story, because it encourages you to do your bit for the country and do something good by going out and buying lots more stuff. And then, the third thing that ecolinguistics does is it contributes to the search for new stories to live by. So if the current stories in our society are leading to increased inequality, leading to increased air pollution, increasing obesity and starvation elsewhere, then the stories are not working. And we need to look for new stories to live by. What I mean by that is new and different ways of using language that tell different stories. So where can we look for new stories to live by? I'm going to give some examples, and then I'm going to ask you to have a chat with the people around you and come up with other examples. Lyrical science writing, like Rachel Carson, the way she writes, it encourages you to actually care about the environment being destroyed. So she gives you all the scientific information about what's happening to the environment, but she writes lyrically in the way that really makes you care. New nature writing, it's a fantastic school of nature writing. In fact, I can see someone here who would be in that school. And it's a very different and interesting way of looking at nature. Maybe I'll say more about that later. And then Native American sources, actually indigenous sources from around the world, provide ways of using language that are much more earth-centered rather than human-centered. And Japanese sources, so I studied Japanese haiku and Japanese animation, and there's a deep respect for nature that is built into traditional Japanese culture. And it's reflected in the ways that they use language. And new economics, so like Bhutan's gross national happiness as an alternative to gross domestic product. Because we just tend to measure money changing hands, and the more money that changes hands, the better. But it's not better if only a few people are happier and everyone else is miserable. So in Bhutan they measure gross national happiness, which is so much better. And many more. Okay. So this is a point for me to stop. Could you have a little chat with the people around you? And could you come up with some other examples of places to look for new stories to live by? You can just chat with each other, and then I'll ask for some.
But saying, okay, so it's not your animal science, just looking at people who are really thinking about how with animals that's what I think. I think new animal rights organizations the way for example, society is really good.
So I'm going to ask if you want to just shout out some other places, some kind of texts or schools of text that you find inspiring and that the language used in them can help us to do what you want to do with your ecological philosophy, which might be reconnecting with nature or whatever it is. And Miri, could you write these down for me, and I'll let them discuss. But over to you. Do you want to shout out some?
From this group, we came with storytelling and oral tradition, then language of protest, and look at the past. Look at past writers, past.
Yeah, because I say new stories, but a lot of these are old stories from the past that we have to bring back into the present. Yeah. And one of our stories is that we always have to go forwards, and that if you take something from the past, that's backwards and it's bad, but we have to get over that, don't we?
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, let's go around this way. Anyone else from?
Make sure you speak up, please.
Ah.
Yes. Well, we had just a couple of things. One was old stories, as in marginalised 20th century literature that is in keeping with what we're talking about, but is less well known and less celebrated other 20th century literature. And then also something about the history of environmentalist writing and relating that to observation of actual progress in people doing things, making things happen.
Yeah, I find Rachel Carson encouraged the whole thing at the beginning. Sometimes I find it hard to find an example of an environmentalist writer who's had that kind of impact. Great, okay. So, from somewhere
I'm afraid I didn't give the others that much chance to talk. But I said, we create new stories by doing new things. So the examples I gave were, for example, setting up the Bristol Pound creates a new story, or setting up a repair shop in Frome, or a share shop in Frome. You know, these things are all creating new ways of being, and therefore from that stories emerge and new language emerges.
Yeah, so we've got like a story of shiny new things are great. You set up a repair shop, and then you're valuing actually repairing old things, and that these are much more valuable. So these are new stories. Okay, other?
Well, under my wicked influence, we went a little bit off track and talked about visual stories,
That's great.
which were the ones that we were talking about earlier, actually, the YouTube videos about sort of interspecies friendship and, care, and a sort of inspiring sense of care and compassion beyond species boundaries, and not just coming from humans, but, cats and dogs and elephants and hippos and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and the visual is obviously part of it. We tell stories through visuals. And we were chatting earlier about music and telling stories through music as well.
I'm quite interested in the idea of these sort of, in a way, the things like repair shops and lots of amazing action in Bristol, and other places around here. And then setting those, seeing really small stories against massive stories like Harari's Sapiens, A History of Humanity, talks about the really long-term myths which really drive where we go in the end, about, things went wrong a couple 100,000 years ago and they're just correcting out maybe somehow or another, and the birth of agriculture and stuff like that. So those massive stories, or those really long-term stories against sort of local action, it's more of a question than a...
Yeah, and the local action, if it can also be linguistic action. So it's doing things, but also talking about things in new ways and spreading that. Let me carry on. Later on, I'll ask you again if you have other sources. But I wanted to go through some of the different types of the stories that we live by. Because in the book that I wrote, I identified 8 types. But I've actually come up with a couple more since then. So the second edition will have more, and you might be able to come up with more of them. I thought I'd start with identity, because it is the most fun. Identities are stories about what it means to be a particular kind of person. Stories are all like this. They're stories about whether an area of life is good or bad, or whether something is a threat or not a threat. This is identities, what it means to be a particular kind of person. So my example for this is Men's Health magazine. Okay, so Men's Health magazine, like any lifestyle magazine, sets up images of what it means to be an ideal man. And if you look at the cover, then you'll find that there's short noun phrases, or there's imperatives, and there's lots of capital letters as well. And because it's a lifestyle magazine, any of these short phrases presupposes its own desirability. So beach muscle now presupposes that that would be a desirable thing to have. And so you can look at these and you can say, well, what does this presuppose that an ideal man would be like? Well, the most obvious thing is that the ideal man is hugely muscular, enormously muscular.
We all know better than that.
Yeah. But you might say, well, okay, what's the ecological consequence of that? Okay, but the point is that this magazine is trying to make you feel inadequate because with only a few exceptions, no one looks like this. And so you're never going to get that, especially with the kind of 3 minutes to huge muscles while you're eating a pizza a day kind of discourse in the magazine. So you feel inadequate, and then you buy the huge, enormous cars that are sold in the magazine. And there's another connection here, which is with meat, because the magazine promotes meat endlessly. And this isn't because the major health concern about men is that they don't eat enough meat. It's because of the image of meat and masculinity goes together so strongly. So they link the muscles with the meat. So I eat a lot of meat. I'm not boasting. I need the protein for muscular growth. So this idea that eating meat is the kind of thing that you would boast about is presupposed there. Their steak is a reliable weapon and they battle to bulk up. So we've got this metaphor of the meat as the weapon. And that's another story that's in the magazine, is about the ideal man having huge muscles, eating a lot of meat, and also being very aggressive and competitive. And so we can say that, well, you've got these language and images, it sets up an image of what it means for an ideal man, and it's not a very good image because it encourages you to buy very fast cars and eat lots of meat. And also encourages you to be very violent. So have a look at this. Some quotes: Viking raider, Mongol marauder, successful Saxon smashing. But what's the environmental consequence of setting up men to be vastly competitive, focused on their own huge muscles and salary? Well, the problem is that this is using a lot of energy and effort and manpower, which is put into being just completely isolated in competing with other men. Now, if you took all that manpower and you applied it to environmental problems, you'd solve them all.
With some female assistance, perhaps.
Well, yes. Well, I think that the women are doing it. I mean, if you look at ecofeminism, then women are driving sustainability across the world. And it's the men who are holding it back through the kind of images of masculinity. So I think the women are doing it already, and we need to get those men on board as well. So
you could have had women's magazines promoting equally problematic stuff.
Exactly. So women's magazines.
Men's magazine.
Yeah, the Cosmopolitan magazine. It's like promoting women at work, which is a bit of an advance, but always at work it's just competing with other people for salary and position, and never doing something useful for the world.
Well, can I just chip in now as we're sort of having got all these publications quite rightly so. So I said it in a talk that The Guardian on Saturday is a consumption porn magazine, really. It's just full of adverts. And I took them all out and put them in show. It's about 250, 300 adverts. And so it's meant to be our most radical, sort of left-wing, environmentally friendly thing. But even that is just full of consumption images.
Yeah, absolutely. And then if they have airline advertisements, then they're not going to be saying anything negative about airlines. So the ideal man, competitive, working out on his own to gain power, status, muscle performance, and not actions which benefit the world. And there is an exception. So there is one exception where men are actually represented as connecting with other people. Can you imagine what it is?
Sports.
Sex.
Oh, right. Right. Yeah.
So if you look at that, then even sex is an excuse for a workout. And I think it's not a very flattering image for women, because in this metaphor, women are the gym equipment. Okay, so obviously the identities in Men's Health magazine are hugely problematic, but we also want to look for positive discourses, positive discourse analysis. Let's look for ecological identities, which I define as identities where humans are considered to be part of a group which includes non-humans, just as a kind of a basic idea of ecological identities. So we can look for positive discourses which create much more ecological identities. And so we could look at Aldo Leopold. I think Greg Garrard tends to criticise Aldo Leopold, but he criticises everyone anyway, so that's all right. Because we abuse land because we regard it as a commodity. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. So he's reframing it from a commodity to a community. It's the land community. It includes humans as well as other animals and plants and earth and ground. Then we've got Esther Wolfenson. She's talking about a pigeon that she rescued. She says, together, in spite of our obvious differences, we were bound as any two creatures on earth by something only too measurable, life itself. So then we've got the pronoun use of we, which includes a human and an animal together in that category of we. Then we've got Robert Macfarlane, we have to mention, of course. So two big seals slipped into the water, rolled onto their backs and sculled past the mouth of the gulch, gazing at me. They both dived. For 10 seconds or so, we stared at each other. So we've got the pronoun we there. But you've also got this word stared, and the censor, which is the subject of the verb, is both the seals and Robert Macfarlane. So they're both there as censors of the same verb. And then you've got the reciprocal pronoun, each other. So this type of language is building ecological identities. Okay, let's have a break. So, do you want to have a quick chat about ecological identities and other kinds of evil identities? Let's get some feedback in a minute.
So yeah, because like suffering, and there's not very much that we can do. I mean, like join our organization and do something against that. I mean, they're trying. I think that they do also supporting the doing something
But what am I doing? Like, they send us letters like once a month or something. I get this letter. On this letter, there's these dead animals or like this horrible images. You know how they are. I'm shocked by it. I feel sad by it. I feel frustrated by it. And so when I finish looking at it, what are my options? I can.
Any comments? No? Okay, how about the side of the room?
Well, we had two thoughts, but one thought that struck me was that apparently, certainly in Australia, I don't know what it's like here, but in Australia there's a considerable kind of falling away from environmental interest, interest in nature, critters and so on, among boys in their mid-teens. So primary schools, they engage the boys and the girls. In secondary schools, some of the girls retain their interest and it gets deeper, but a lot of the boys fall away in terms of it's just not a kind of cool thing to be interested in. And I guess, presumably that's linked up with the kind of messages that they're getting in their mid-teens about what it means to be a boy. So I guess just kind of bearing out the critique that you were making. But on the other hand, Richard had an interesting point.
Well, I suppose it's that, in a sense, what you're presenting is a sorting of things very categorically into good and bad. And a story is something that, if it's a successful story, it's something that engages with emotional needs. And it is a structure which leads to moments of emotional release. And that might be something that stories on both sides of this sort of moral dividing line that you're drawing have in common. and they address different audiences, as you're saying. And so I think, you know, the question of the structure of stories, the emotional needs that stories address, has to come into this, doesn't it? And one has to look at the parallels between the good and the bad, as well as simply saying this one's virtuous and this one's evil.
Absolutely. I should say at that point that I judge stories whether they're good or bad through my own ecosophy, my ecological philosophy. So when I say a story is good, I don't really mean it. I mean it agrees with my ecological philosophy. When I say it's bad, I mean I'd say this opposes my ecological philosophy. And that is actually what everyone does when they do critical discourse analysis. They're comparing the discourse with their own ideological interest and saying it's bad if it disagrees with them, and it's good if it agrees with them. And you can criticise that, but my point with ecolinguistics is at least people are judging the stories against an ecosophy which by definition includes consideration of the more than human world. So ecolinguistics works if people have the right, good ecosophies, and it doesn't work if they have ecosophies which are really far-fetched and crazy. But at least an ecosophy considers the more than human world. And all I really wanted is to get linguists to think not just about human relationships with each other, but human relationships with other humans and other species and the physical environment.
I suppose one way of looking at the good and bad problem is that you only by getting past the bad, people think, hang on a minute, there must be a good story here somewhere. So let's see what we can do with this. But you need to get past the men's health and Vogue, although you said the Teen Vogue was different, and all that kind of stuff first, and then you can say, okay, but what else is going on here?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think our conversation revealed the inevitable inadequacy of one's ecological identity in the face of the good and the bad. You know, I mean, how unachievable a good ecological identity might be, we felt in our conversation. I mean, one of us just felt real guilt about not living up to the good, and the other felt that they dropped between identities, from some of which there was learning taking place, but actually not being able to be part of that group. So there was a general unease in our conversation, I think, wasn't there?
Yes, it's not quite fitting into an identity in one way or the other.
Yeah, and the problem is when the identities that we feel we need to take on are not recognised in the mainstream, and we don't fit into the categories that the mainstream provides. And then we've got to forge new identities.
Is it? I don't know. Well, I've got a question. I mean, maybe I should save it for questions. I'm not clear whether we're sort of opening up that. I'm just not clear whether it's really possible to say that I develop my ecological philosophy and then I stand on that rock, and from there I sort of judge all these narratives and language that comes along as to whether or not it fits or not, because it's a far more cyclical, iterative process, isn't it? That your personal sort of ecological philosophy is continually modified by the language that you consume, and you know, maybe you even generating language yourself. So
that's exactly what I say about ecological philosophy. Not something that you decide and then that's it for the rest of your life. It changes all the time, it evolves and it grows. And I find my ecological philosophy changes as I'm analysing the texts. So when I find something deeply inspiring that takes me in a different direction, my ecological philosophy evolves. So it's a lifetime journey and it's never fixed. But when you're writing your ecolinguistics paper, you write it according to the ecosophy that you've got at the moment.
Yeah.
And the idea is to be upfront about it rather than just saying this is good or bad, but this is good because of this underlying cause. Sorry, did you?
I just found it interesting when you said that ecofeminism in the way. A lot of feminists actually feel that ecofeminism is propagating this gender stereotype that women and home and environment. So some of the feminists actually view that as an evil.
Oh yeah, I know that there's a lot of criticism of ecofeminism in feminism, especially the goddess worship and things. But yeah, let's go into that. Can I? That's definitely something to explore, absolutely, when it comes to gender identities. Can I go on and do a couple more types of story that we live by? So, metaphors, obviously metaphors, but actually metaphors can become quite embedded in society and shape how we see things. Or they can be embedded in particular groups and shape how particular groups see things. So my examples for this is pigs. I always have to have one example about pigs in everything I do. So this is Wall's Meat Company. You might have seen this one before. So breeding cells should be thought of as and treated as a valuable piece of machinery whose function is to pump out baby pigs like a sausage machine. So this is Wall's Meat Company, and they were saying this in the 70s. Peter Singer picked it up, and it's in his book, Animal Liberation. And obviously, this is a story which has certain metaphorical entailments, that pigs don't have feelings, and therefore you can treat them however you want. You can squash them into little cages, and so long as they don't die, then you can do whatever you want to them because they don't have feelings. So it's a story which encourages us to treat pigs in an inhumane way, and it justifies a kind of intensive farming that is deeply ecologically damaging. But of course, Peter Singer wrote this in the 70s, and the meat companies don't use this type of language anymore. You have to look more subtly. So I analysed the pork industry handbook, which was not fun. I read the whole thing from beginning to end, all about how to raise and kill pigs. Not nice, but it's important to do, because when you look at it, then you see that the pigs and machine metaphor is still there, but it's just more subtly presented. So
it's quite similar to the men's health magazines, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Relaxation ration, yeah. So you can see that the metaphor is kind of more subtly embedded. This is why you start to need linguistic analysis to reveal these stories and then to criticise them. And I did have some success with this in the sense that an industry journal, a meat industry journal, did pick up on my analyses, and they said that we need to change not just how we are talking about animals, but also how we treat them. But the idea is that you critique the language and you hope that the people responsible for the discourse will think about changing. Maybe I'm too optimistic. So yes, so it's justifying the ecologically damaging form of farming. So just analyse it like that. So stories influence how we think, talk, and act. Right, so I'm going to zoom through convictions, okay? So, convictions, a story about whether a particular description of the world is true, uncertain, or false. So this is an important description of the world. Climate change is caused by humans. And whether we think of it as true, uncertain, or false is going to influence how we act about climate change. So, Barack Obama has this story that climate change is caused by humans is true. And you can see that in the type of language that he uses. So he says, gas can power our economy with less of the carbon pollution that causes climate change. That presupposes that carbon pollution causes climate change. And he uses the word pollution for carbon, which frames it in a particular way. And then we've got the Fraser Institute, a right-wing think tank, and it represented as uncertain. It talks about scientific debate. And then we've got our favourite, who sees it as a hoax caused by the Chinese, representing it as false. But there are worse people than Donald Trump, like Webster Tarpley. Just read that. Pseudo-scientific fraud, a big lie, it's a monstrosity. And he actually compares climate scientists to Nazis. And he's representing it as absolutely false. And so, what I'm saying with this about the stories are that the stories are kind of in our culture, and you have these different forces who are trying to put these stories into our minds. And there's a great big struggle over this. And I feel it's a struggle that we're losing about climate change. That the forces which are saying that it isn't caused by humans, or that there's nothing we can do about it, are so strong that we're losing the battle with that one. But yeah, so awareness of how language represents things as true or uncertain or false, and how that tells stories which can influence population. So, this is one of my favourite ones, is erasure. A story that an area of life is unimportant or unworthy of consideration. And for this, the area of life that I think is erased in so many discourses that surround us is the more than human world. So the world of animals, plants, forests, rivers, trees, air, rain, weather. It's erased from so many different discourses. And it's important because, to quote Leopold again, we can be ethical only in relation to something we can see, feel, understand, love, or otherwise have faith in. And I've invented 3 types of erasure. There's kind of these grand names. The void is my first type. So something important is present in reality but entirely absent in the discourse. And of course, what that something important is depends on your ecosophy. So if we look at the discourse of neoclassical economics, let's not look at it too much, but what we see is an absence of any kind of recognition of animals, plants, nature, even though they are fundamental to the economy. And this is a quote about these textbooks. So if you just have a look at that. And I have analysed a lot of economics textbooks, and it's absolutely true. You have these equations where the output is labour times machines. So if you double the labour in machines, you double the output of the things that you're making. So never mind all of the natural resources that go into it and everything that is destroyed to make the product. It's totally erased. Okay, so my second type of erasure, the trace. So something important is present in reality, but only a hint or indirect reference to it remains. Now this one is really important because a lot of environmental discourse or ecological discourse, scientific ecology, actually erases the thing that they're talking about. So the National Ecosystem Assessment, so I've analysed that. And in fact, they invited me to be part of a working group which was writing the second version of this, so I could actually get involved in the discourse. Can you see how nature, animals, plants, they're there, but at the same time they're erased? So urban green space amenity, there's some trees in there, there's some grass in there, distant, far away. The wetland habitat, well, in the wetland habitat, that's the home of the animals, but the animals aren't there, it's just their home. Living in physical environments, well, somewhere in there are the animals and plants. Seasonally grazed floodplains. Well, who is doing the grazing? There must be someone doing the grazing. There must be something being grazed. So they're there, but there's just subtle hints of them there. And that's my favourite one, is biomass. So, I talk about it with my students. I say the biomass of my class is 0.5 ton. They look at me and say, oh, that's a horrible way to think about us. And then the mask. Okay, so the mask is something important, is erased and replaced with a distorted version of itself. So you can see I'm kind of drawing from Baudrillard. And my example of that are the singing cows, which I won't show you, but so we're lucky cows, we chew the cud and browse, because we get our greens and eggs like that. So they're singing about the products of their own exploitation. And then this one makes beef sing. So this cow is singing in delight because he knows that his meat will be eaten with HP sauce. So Kathy then says that representations in advertising and speaking animals who are selling the end products of the brutal processes they enjoy in the factory farm system serve a dual discursive purpose. The first purpose is to sell products, and the second role is to make the animal victim disappear. And so these discourses are erasing animals as beings who have a mental life and who have feelings and have purposes. And it's getting them away from our minds. And so it's a story that they're unimportant because they're kind of not there. And the last type of story is salience. This is where you're representing the natural world as if it's something important, as if it's worthy of attention. You're giving it priority and salience. And then you can see this in new nature writing. So in the pronoun use of he or she instead of it. I'm just going to go through this really quickly. Active agents. So this is in the book Nature Cure. There's 15 verbs there that are material processes, verbs of doing things. And the agent, one who's actively doing them, in all of them are birds, representing birds very actively as agents of material processes. And then you've got levels of abstraction. So peregrines, ospreys, cranes, salmon. These are ones you can imagine. It's much harder to imagine animal or fauna or natural resources. So they talk at this basic level. That is the most imaginable level. It's Lakoff and Johnson's theory. And then lastly, the sense image. So this, well, you know, because I know that lots of people are into eco-criticism here. So this is where you're representing what the person would see, hear, touch, taste or smell if they were right there in nature, interacting with the things around them. So if you look at the second one there, so he, a peregrine, flew in an easy loop, and when the sunlight glanced, his undersides, they were pale and banded like rippled sycamores. It really just puts you there, you're looking up at the bird, and you're seeing it. And then visual salience, because the cover of the book captures that perfectly. So you can see that the bird is there, it's in the centre of the image, it's against a plain background, it's in the foreground, it's got great salience, it's represented as an individual, not just a part of a flock, shall we say. So that's it. So what I'm saying about salience is that new nature writing makes the plants and animals and natural world salient in our mind. It tells a story that it's important and encourages us to respect it. And that's it. I'm done.
Well, I think we've got, yes, we do have drinks and nibbles. But if you have any questions that you'd like to share before we go into more informal discussion, now is your chance, Sean.
Yes, thank you for that. I'm really glad that you're here because there's a question that I've been curious about ecolinguistics, which is that I wonder how you see the relationship and possibly overlaps and maybe differences with the field of political ecology, which also works very much with environmental discourses and storytelling, and has, been doing that for a few decades now. So perhaps there's some overlap there.
Absolutely, and I think political ecology is, if you're doing actual detailed linguistic analysis of the features, is a form of ecolinguistics. And I think ecolinguistics comes from critical discourse analysis with people like Norman Fairclough, and they are from a political ecology or political economy background. So it's just taking one step from critical discourse analysis and political economy to political ecology. So I see them as absolutely intertwined and interrelated.
Perhaps I can just go on, because I think possibly a very key difference is political ecology addresses in a much more kind of foregrounded way structures of power that make particular stories dominant and exclusionary, and make these other stories that we're talking about with more salience for sustainability, let's say, make them marginalised.
Yes, these are the hegemonic stories. I would say that is very much part of ecolinguistics, even if I didn't do much of it today. But certain stories like What It Means to Be the Ideal Man are hegemonic stories in our society that come from places of power and they serve particular political interests, which makes it hard to fight against them.
Absolutely, and actually just to kind of carry on that point, I think that clearly we need news stories to live by, but the news stories themselves are not going to do anything unless there are sort of practices that people are engaging in with which they resonate. So I guess it's a question of drivers of social change, and it's a complex two-way thing. But the stories by themselves are not going to do it. You've also got to address those kind of structural aspects of power relations and just ways of life, which are obviously bound up with them. Under what circumstances can these salient stories be adopted by more people? There need to be pathways of liberation from a kind of capitalist consumerist society, really, for them to take on, I would say, to take off.
Absolutely.
Well, following that, really, I think it is an account of how stories satisfy people. Because you said you think we're losing the battle over stories about climate change. But the question is why? Why would we be losing that? And it's not clear to me that this is entirely culturally determined. It may be that the stories follow from something more fundamental and material. But one possible reason is that narratives of the kind of life that would be more ecologically responsible are not narratives that very easily provide the forms of emotional release and recognition. Perhaps recognition is very important, and membership that our more traditional narratives do provide. And so, it's not clear to me whether your field of study would get further than the kind of negative analysis of bad ones, I suppose, in a way.
Yeah, that's such a nice point. Yeah.
What would be, how does your area of study connect with the possibility of alternative narrative forms or genres?
Well, that is the second half of it, is the search for new stories to live by. And that's where you look at texts from a wide range of different traditional cultures around the world and alternative movements. And you look at the way they use language to tell different stories, hopefully to try and get out of the rut of stories, like you say, the environmentalist type of stories which do not fulfill people's needs as humans, and find ones that do.
I would say it's a bit different. It's not needs, it's desires. And Deleuze goes on about humans being desiring machines, or whatever. And capitalism is really good at nailing that. So my favourite pet fact at the moment is Nike spends $100 a second globally on marketing, and that's just an indicator of the amount of energy they put into creating their stories. And if you amplify that by all the capitalist business on earth, the theologies, the state, and stuff like that, we live in an ecology of narratives that's so crowded and noisy and got such energy pushing it in one direction that if you've got brilliant ecological storytellers, there's still, my sort of big concern is, and fear, is that it's almost impossible at the moment for those stories to fight against that bigger noise, which is driven by exploitation of desire and backed by incredible creative energy. You've got ad agencies in London who've got geniuses in them, and they know how to nail people to get them to buy stuff.
Yeah, well, that's a common thing people say about ecolinguistics, is that the stories are so entrenched, the dominant stories are so entrenched, that you're not going to be able to shift them and change them. But my point is that the dominant stories are unsustainable, which means that they cannot last. The current civilization or society cannot last. So it's either going to change or it's going to collapse. And then in that collapse, there's a chance to find new stories to live by for the survivors. And so we now need to be thinking about those new stories to live by, so that as industrial civilization unravels, then they're there for people who can take it forwards.
You're getting near Paul Kingsnorth's position.
Yeah, I'm influenced by Paul Kingsnorth.
Sue, yeah. Well, one of the clues, I mean, it may only be tiny, it may only be a tiny clue. But one of the clues is in your interaction with the meat people, insofar as you were able to get them to think about how they wrote about pigs as machines. And the obvious thing is that if you tell a story about, and we know this happens, if you tell a story about a pig, and we've got Esther, you tell a story about a pig in a particular way, you're going to get a different kind of reaction from the one that if you tell the story in the other kind of way. It also depends literally on where you are when you tell the story. So if you tell the story in the factory, then you're not going to get the same reaction if you tell the story in the butcher's, or in the village, or in the field. I mean, one of the things that we will do at this time, I said at 70, is risk life and limb, driving around looking for lambs, because I want to see lambs. I don't eat meat, but I know what these lambs are for. I know perfectly well what these lambs are for. I'm not stupid. And so I know what's happening, but the story I tell myself is a different one, because that's not the story I want to hear. But you tell me that other story and I can hear it perfectly well. It's just a way of shifting the focus, shifting the language. And your example with the meat one is perfect. Yes, it's only a tiny one, it's only tiny, but keeping on, telling better stories, you end up with a better way of looking at pigs.
Yeah, and the United Nations thing was even better, because I wrote a paper about the lack of intrinsic worth of nature in the United Nations reports. And they said, yes, you're absolutely right about this. And then they invited me to go and help with the drafting of the new reports. So, and draft them in a way that gives intrinsic worth to nature. So,
Can I just, keeping on, I can't remember her name, but there's an amazing Turkish poet and journalist, and she was talking about the situation in Turkey more than this stuff, but she was saying, for me, hope is not a useful word at the moment, it's too fragile, but she said determination is what
keeping on.
Going back slightly to Owen's previous point about the idea of consumerism and capitalism, it's completely, whether or not they want us to think it, it's completely driven by the consumer, but they need us to think that we need the products. And so there's been a story fairly recently where companies have taken their advertising out of certain newspapers and magazines because of the types of articles they've been publishing, because they've been asked by their customers not to advertise in those areas, because I think we have a feeling it's probably Daily Mail, and they were talking about immigrants, and the type of language they were using was so derogatory and negative that so many people felt strongly enough about it to actually change who then advertised in that paper.
yeah, this is a great example of critical language awareness, where people are aware that the Daily Mail becomes racist, and then they start putting pressure on advertisers to leave, and it actually works.
Yeah, because if they're not funded, they can't print it. So.
I've got two more lined up. So Mira.
I just wanted to say, off of what you said, that we should remember that even though we have dominant discourses, we have hegemonic discourses, they're never they're never taking up the full space. There's always a gap where the little, minority discourses can come in and present new stories. So it's never opaque completely, and we always have opportunities for competition between discourses, even as small as they may be.
Terry?
I wonder if you had a category of the utopian story.
Not yet, but...
And whether the utopian story carries a pejorative with it, or how far it encompasses a legitimate idealism, and whether there might be gradations on the way to the utopian story, like the implied good story, the partially achieved improvement story on the way to the utopian story. Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I was looking at this film Carnage. I don't know if you've seen it. Some people have seen it. It's a utopia where everyone becomes vegan and all violence ends, and people are really happy. And then it took us through the steps to get there. And it was really fun as well. And then, so utopian stories as a way of providing some steps of where to go.
I'm looking for a way of easing my challenged ecological identity and it's being stuck in guilt, to see whether there might be some possibility of partial improvement towards my idealism, my story of my ideal life, identity, that's ecologically satisfactory.
I would hope that any kind of small change in the right direction is something to be welcomed. I think the danger is that we look for perfection, and when we see that we're not perfect, then we give up. It's like, I can't be completely vegan, so I'm now going to go and indulge myself totally in meat and dairy.
Small change is a metaphor too.
Small changes in the right direction should be celebrated, and rather than the gap from the ideal being divided.
This is radical incrementalism, isn't it?
Radical incrementalism. Give it to her.
It is useful.
I think in the interest of chilling out and having a drink, we might call it a day there for formal discussion, but I hope that many of you will stay and talk more. Before we disperse, I'll just say that we have some more talks coming up in May. In fact, we have a rash of talks coming up in May. We've been on a kind of monthly cycle with the Environmental Humanities lectures. But on the 10th of May, unexpectedly and delightfully, we have Dolly Jørgensen from Sweden, who's a fabulous environmental historian, will be coming and talking about the reintroduction of the beaver in Sweden. She's writing a book on extinctions and reintroductions and kind of probing those processes and the discourses around them indeed. So Dolly will be talking on the beaver, so we've got more animals next time. And then on the 17th of May, we have the eco-philosopher and improvisational jazz musician David Rothenberg, in association with music, will be giving a talk about his music making with non-human others. And then doing a performance as well in the Tibbet Centre, so that's 17th of May. And then later in May, I think it's the last Wednesday in May, we have Joni Adamson from the States, who's played a really important role in the development of the environmental humanities in the US, and she'll be talking about her perspective on the status of the environmental humanities kind of globally. She's got lots of contacts all around the world, so she'll be kind of updating us on what's going on around the place, particularly in Asia. So, so if you're not on our email list and would like to be, please drop me a line, k.rigby@BathSpa. We also have a Twitter feed now for environmental humanities, and we're developing a blog. So there are various ways in which you'll be able to keep up with what's going on, which is a lot. We're very busy. So I'll just ask you to join me in thanking Arran once again.